Jerome Carter was 38 years old, and until that Tuesday night, he believed he had built something unbreakable. 9 years of work, 11 men on his crew, a contracting business he grew from one truck, and a handshake reputation into a company that kept beating every competitor in Atlanta, including a man named Grant Tobias, who had been losing bids to Jerome for 3 straight years. Jerome had no idea those losses had become personal enough to cost him everything. That night, Jerome came home to an argument that felt slightly off, too sharp, too rehearsed, each word landing exactly where it needed to land. Then he heard his wife's voice shift from the next room, the tremble, the 911 call, the tears already in place before the police arrived. Jerome was handcuffed in his own driveway while Andrea watched from the doorway, and the moment the patrol car turned the corner, she stopped crying entirely. 2 days later, Jerome learned his business accounts had been drained that same morning, before she ever picked up the phone. What happened over the next 3 years would shock everyone who thought they knew how this story ended. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The early morning Atlanta air hung thick with humidity as Jerome Carter stood at the edge of the construction site. Blueprints spread across the hood of his truck. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but his crew was already arriving one by one, their work boots crunching against the gravel. "Morning, Mr. Carter," Marcus called out, adjusting his hard hat as he approached. Jerome nodded, a small smile crossing his face. "How's your boy doing with that science project?" Jerome asked, remembering their conversation from earlier in the week. Marcus's face lit up. "First place, thanks to those tips you gave him about structural support. Kid's already talking about becoming an engineer." Jerome made a mental note to bring in some basic drafting materials he had stored in his garage. Marcus's son showed promise, and Jerome believed in nurturing that kind of interest early. The rest of the crew filtered in as Jerome reviewed the day's objectives. He knew each of them by more than just their names. He knew their stories. Tom was saving for his daughter's college fund. Ray had just bought his first house. Chris was helping his mother with medical bills. These weren't just workers. They were people who trusted him with their livelihoods. "We're running the electrical through the East Wing today," Jerome announced, pointing to the relevant section of the blueprint. "David, I want you leading that. You've got the steadiest hands for the detailed work." David, a veteran electrician who'd been with Carter Construction for 6 years, nodded with quiet pride. Jerome had learned early that recognizing people's specific strengths wasn't just good management. It was how you built loyalty. The morning progressed with the steady rhythm Jerome had cultivated over 9 years of building his company. From one truck and a helper to this, 11 skilled workers, commercial and residential licenses, and contracts with 3 major Atlanta development firms. He'd built it all on a foundation of showing up on time and finishing what he started. Around noon, Jerome's phone buzzed. A text from Andrea. "Handled the networking lunch. Met some interesting people. We'll tell you about it tonight." He texted back a quick thank you. The job site emergency, a delivery mix-up that could have delayed their timeline by weeks, had kept him from attending. He was grateful Andrea had stepped in to represent Carter Construction. She understood the importance of maintaining those relationships. Later that afternoon, while inspecting the framing work, Jerome overheard 2 of his newer crew members discussing another construction project across town. "Tobias and Associates," one said, shaking his head. "All flash, no substance. My cousin worked for them last year, said they underbid everything and then couldn't staff the jobs properly." Jerome knew Grant Tobias's reputation. Tobias and Associates spent more on marketing in a month than Carter Construction spent in a year. They had the glossy website, the radio ads, the billboard on I-85. But, in the last 3 years, Jerome had won every major contract they'd competed for. Clients appreciated marketing, but they valued reliability more. The sun was setting when Jerome finally pulled into his driveway. The house was quiet. Andrea was probably still at her yoga class. He grabbed a glass of water and settled at the kitchen table, reviewing the day's progress notes. The house around him held the comfortable silence of a life carefully built. The kitchen where he'd installed the cabinets himself. The back deck he'd rebuilt last summer. The dining room where he and Andrea hosted their families for holidays. Everything in its place. Everything earned through work and time. Andrea's keys rattled in the front door. She moved through the house with that restless energy he'd grown familiar with lately. He understood it. She was ambitious, always looking toward the next thing. It was one of the reasons he'd given her full access to their accounts years ago. She had good instincts for opportunity. "The networking lunch went well," she said, pouring herself some water. "Met someone very well connected in the development space." Jerome nodded, absorbed in his notes. "That's good. Thanks for handling it." She paused, maybe waiting for him to ask more questions, but he was tired. Tomorrow would bring another early morning, another day of building something solid and real. The kitchen table held him comfortably, the water glass cool against his palm. Outside, crickets began their evening chorus. Everything was exactly where he'd left it. Everything was as it should be. Jerome's truck pulled into the driveway just after 7. The sky had already darkened, and through the kitchen window, he could see Andrea moving with sharp, deliberate motions. Something felt different about her restlessness tonight. More precise, like a performance being carefully measured. He walked through the back door, setting his keys on the counter. The air in the kitchen felt thick with something he couldn't name. "You're late," Andrea said. Her voice had an edge he'd never heard before, theatrical almost, each word placed with careful intent. Job site ran long. Had to verify the electrical work before. "Dinner's cold," she cut him off, gesturing at a plate he hadn't noticed. "I waited 2 hours." Jerome paused, studying her face. This wasn't her usual frustration. Every movement, every word felt rehearsed, calibrated for maximum effect. "I'm sorry about dinner. Let me heat it up. We can—" "I'm tired of being an afterthought, Jerome." Her volume increased slightly, perfectly modulated. "You're always at that site, always with that crew. What about me? What about this house? What about everything I've given up?" The escalation felt mechanical, like watching gears turn in a precise sequence. Jerome took a deep breath, recognizing the heat building in the room. "Let's take a minute," he said quietly. "This feels bigger than dinner." "Don't dismiss me." Her voice rose again, but her eyes remained calculating. "You always do this. Act so calm, so reasonable, while I'm just the emotional wife who doesn't understand your important work." Jerome felt the trap in her words, the careful construction of a narrative he wanted no part of. He turned toward the garage door. "I'm going to step outside for a few minutes. We can talk when—" "Walking away." "Of course you are. That's what you do, isn't it?" Each accusation landed with practiced precision, but her eyes held something colder than anger. Jerome closed the garage door behind him, leaning against his workbench. The familiar smell of sawdust and motor oil usually calmed him, but tonight it couldn't touch the unease growing in his chest. Then he heard it. Andrea's voice through the door, transformed, the sharp edge replaced by a carefully crafted tremor. "Please, I need help." Her tone had dropped into perfect terror. "Yes, this is 1847 Oakland Drive. My husband, he's so angry. I'm scared." Jerome's blood went cold. He walked back inside, moving slowly. Andrea stood at the kitchen counter, phone pressed to her ear, tears placed with cosmetic precision on her cheeks. She looked at him across the room, and in that moment, he saw it. The absolute absence of fear behind the performance. "He's here now," she said into the phone, her voice shaking while her eyes remained steady. "Please hurry." 6 minutes. That's how long it took for the red and blue lights to start flashing through the windows. Jerome stood exactly where he was, hands visible, breathing measured. The officers entered with weapons drawn. Jerome kept his voice calm, his movements slow. "Officers, there's been a misunderstanding. I haven't— Hands where we can see them." The command cut through his words. "Turn around, slowly." Jerome complied, hyper-aware of every motion. He could see Andrea through the window, crying on cue for the female officer who'd taken her aside. The performance was flawless. The handcuffs were cold. Jerome walked to the patrol car with dignity, even as neighbors peeked through their windows. As the car pulled away, he caught one last glimpse of Andrea in the doorway. The tears had stopped. She watched him go with the still attention of someone monitoring a plan's execution. 2 days passed in the holding cell. Jerome sat on the narrow bunk, measuring time by meal deliveries and shift changes. When Philip arrived for visitation, his cousin's face carried news worse than the handcuffs. "Jerome," Philip said, his voice low, "the accounts are empty. Both of them, business and personal. Nearly $74,000, transferred out yesterday morning." Jerome sat very still, processing the timing. "Yesterday morning? What time?" "First transfer was initiated at 8:47 a.m., second one at 9:03. Both completed before noon." Philip paused, before the 911 call was even made. The truth settled over Jerome like concrete setting. The transfers were scheduled. The argument was scripted. The tears were rehearsed. This wasn't a wife reacting in fear or anger. This was a calculated plan with a financial phase that had been put in motion before he ever came home. He stared at the holding cell wall, seeing the structure of it now, how every piece had been measured and cut to fit, like a house built to look stable while the foundation was being quietly undermined. The woman he'd trusted with everything, who had access to every account because he believed in sharing everything, had executed a coordinated financial strike before she ever picked up the phone to destroy the rest of his life. The courtroom felt smaller than Jerome expected. From the defendant's table, he could see every face in the jury box with perfect clarity. 12 strangers who would decide his fate based on carefully crafted performances they had no tools to question. His public defender, Sarah Mills, spread her limited case materials across the table. She was good at her job, sharp, dedicated, fighting against an impossible caseload and resource constraints that turned every defense into an uphill battle. Jerome watched her shuffle through the thin file, knowing she was doing her best with what she had. Andrea took the stand like she'd been preparing for it her whole life. Her navy blue dress was modest, her makeup subtle enough to project sincerity. She spoke in measured tones that cracked at precisely the right moments. "I tried to be supportive," she testified, her voice carrying just enough tremor. The business was everything to him. "I managed our finances, kept our home, attended events when he couldn't. I thought if I just did enough, if I just helped enough." She paused, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Jerome watched her performance with the detached attention of a contractor studying faulty workmanship. Every pause was calculated. Every tear was placed like a nail driven to the exact depth needed to hold something false in place. Delia Cross took the stand next. Their neighbor of 5 years shifted in her seat, discomfort visible in her posture. She testified about the night in question, the shouting she heard, the crash that followed. "It was loud," she said. "I heard raised voices, and then there was this crashing sound." Both statements were technically true. What she didn't say, what Jerome could see her wrestling with as she spoke, was that she heard no physical altercation. The crash had been a trash can lid in the alley, but something kept her from offering that context, and Jerome noted how her eyes flickered toward the gallery when she finished speaking. The photographs hit like hammer blows, 8x10 color prints showing bruises on Andrea's arms and torso, entered into evidence by the prosecutor with clinical precision. Sarah objected, requesting time to have the images examined by an expert. The judge denied the motion, They had no budget for forensic analysis and no grounds to delay based on speculation. Jerome studied the photographs as they were displayed for the jury. The bruising patterns looked wrong to his experienced eye, too uniform, too carefully placed. But he couldn't articulate why, and his defender had no resources to bring in someone who could. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Jerome stood as they filed back in, his posture straight, his face composed. The foreman's voice seemed to come from somewhere far away. On the charge of aggravated assault in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. The judge's words followed. 3 years, Georgia State Prison. Jerome maintained his dignity as the sentence was read. He let his eyes move across the gallery, taking inventory of who had come to watch his life be dismantled. That's when he saw him, Grant Tobias, seated 2 rows behind Andrea, a man who had no stated connection to this case and no reason to attend this trial. As Andrea moved past Grant's row toward the exit, Jerome caught it. The smallest nod of acknowledgement between them, quick enough to miss if you weren't watching for it. Jerome filed that image away with the precision of a man who catalogs every measurement on a job site. That night, in his first cell at Georgia State Prison, Jerome sat on the narrow cot. The mattress was thin, the springs creaking under his weight. The small desk lamp cast weak yellow light across the concrete walls. He took out the legal pad they'd given him in processing and uncapped the prison-approved pen. At the top of the first page, he wrote 2 names with careful, measured strokes: Andrea Carter Grant, Tobias. Below them, he began a list: dates, times, details, connections. His handwriting was steady, each entry precise. This wasn't grief pouring onto the page. This was inventory. This was foundation work. This was a man who built things for a living, laying out the materials he would need for what came next. The light from the corridor cast harsh shadows through the cell bars, but Jerome kept writing. Each entry was a nail, each detail a board, each connection a joint that would eventually bear weight. He wrote with the focused attention of a craftsman measuring twice before making the first cut. Through the visitor room's bulletproof glass, Jerome Carter studied his cousin's face. 14 months of these visits had created a routine. Philip arriving with a manila envelope full of documents, Jerome ready with his legal pad of new research requests. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the metal visiting booth, but Jerome's focus remained sharp and clear. "You've been busy," Philip said, spreading out the documents one by one. "Every program they offer in here, legal research certification, business administration, contract law. The warden's office says you're their most consistent student." Jerome nodded once. Education wasn't a pastime here. It was preparation. He spent his days in the prison's legal aid library, learning the system's mechanics from the inside out. Every book, every document, every procedure manual became another tool in his inventory. "Tell me what you found," Jerome said quietly, his voice steady. Philip took out the first document, a copy of an LLC filing Jerome had asked him to trace. "It's worse than we thought. Andrea used those power of attorney documents you signed 2 years ago. Remember those estate planning papers she said were routine? She transferred your contractor's license into a new shell company 3 months after conviction." Jerome remembered signing those papers across their kitchen table, Andrea explaining they were just standard protection for their growing assets. His pen had moved across the pages without hesitation because trust, at that point, was still complete. "The shell company feeds directly into Tobias and Associates," Philip continued. "Grant's absorbed everything. Your licensing, your vendor relationships, even your company's reputation in the market. He's been systematically harvesting what you built." Jerome made a note on his pad, his handwriting precise. "The crew?" "He approached your top 3 within 60 days of the conviction, positioned himself as their savior, offered to rescue them from a failing company." Philip's voice held contained anger. Marcus and Deshawn told him to go to hell, but Terrell took it, Jerome finished. He wasn't surprised. Terrell had a sick mother, 2 kids in private school. Pressure finds the stress points in any structure. He seemed torn up about it, Philip added. But yeah, he's running one of Grant's crews now. Jerome nodded once. He didn't write Terrell's name on the list. Some choices came from vulnerability rather than malice. The development contracts? Grant's got 2 of your 3 main relationships, Horizon Development and Sterling Properties. Philip laid out more papers. He's been having private conversations with their project managers, implying your legal situation reflects deeper instability issues, the kind that might affect future projects. Jerome absorbed this, adding notes in his measured handwriting. Character assassination was effective precisely because it was hard to disprove, especially from inside a cell. "What about Delia Cross?" he asked. "She's been avoiding my calls since right after the trial. Won't answer her door when I stop by." Philip paused. "Something's got her spooked, Jerome. She knows something." Jerome made another note without commenting. "Delia would matter later. Everything mattered later if you documented it properly. I need you to find me a criminal defense attorney," Jerome said. "Someone who specializes in post-conviction work. Someone with access to forensic resources, digital evidence analysis, image authentication, cell tower data recovery." "Already started looking," Philip replied. "There's a woman named Dorothy Ames, 25 years experience, focuses on overturning convictions based on evidence irregularities, takes cases pro bono if she sees enough merit in the appeal strategy." Jerome wrote the name. "Get me everything you can find on her case history. Every conviction she's overturned. Every evidence challenge she's won. I want to know exactly what she looks for in a case before she commits." Philip nodded, gathering the documents as visiting hours drew to a close. Jerome took the papers. Evidence of Andrea's financial maneuvers, Grant's business absorption, the systematic dismantling of everything he'd built, and folded them carefully. Back in his cell, Jerome lifted his thin mattress and tucked the documents underneath with the others. He sat at his small desk, legal pad open, prison lamp casting weak light across the page. He wrote 4 new entries with the same steady hand that had once signed construction contracts. 1. Power of attorney transfer, Shell LLC structure. Trace full ownership chain. 2. Contractor license transfer timeline. Document all parties involved. 3. Development contract interference. Gather witness statements from project managers. 4. Delia Cross. Document all avoided contact attempts. Identify potential pressure points. Each entry was a nail-driven true, each detail a board cut square. Jerome wasn't building in anger. He was building in precision, the way he'd always built everything. Measuring twice, cutting once, making sure every joint would hold when weight was applied. That evening, after Philip's footsteps had faded from the visitor area, Jerome sat on his narrow prison cot with his back against the concrete wall. The cell was quiet except for the distant sounds of other inmates, but Jerome's mind was anything but silent. He closed his eyes, finally allowing himself to fully process what he now understood with crushing clarity. Andrea had sat across from him at their kitchen table, accepting the coffee he made her every morning, while carrying Grant's business card in her purse. She had slept beside him in their bed, while maintaining a separate phone line for Grant's calls. She had accepted Jerome's complete trust. Access to their accounts, power of attorney, every document he signed without hesitation, while systematically preparing to use that trust as a weapon. The specific intimacy of the betrayal settled into his chest like concrete setting. Every morning kiss, every casual touch, every moment of supposed vulnerability, all of it had been performance, not just lies, but sustained daily deception requiring dedication most people couldn't maintain. She hadn't stumbled into betrayal. She had built it methodically, the way Jerome built houses, foundation first, then framework, then finishing work. He remembered specific moments with new context. Andrea suggesting they update their estate planning documents, her voice casual as she slid the power of attorney papers across the table. Her increased interest in the business finances, asking detailed questions about account structures and vendor relationships. The networking lunch she attended on his behalf, the first documented meeting with Grant, though Jerome hadn't known to document it then. The money transfers were the clearest evidence of premeditation. She had initiated them before the 911 call, before the crocodile tears, before the performance for the officer. The financial execution phase was already in motion before she ever picked up the phone. She had negotiated her compensation with Grant before she committed to the plan. Jerome opened his eyes, looking at the cinder block wall across from his cot. He made a conscious, deliberate choice in that moment. He would not let this make him bitter. Bitterness was a luxury he couldn't afford. It would compromise his precision, cloud his judgment when he needed it clearest. He would process this pain privately and completely, but he would not let it change who he was at his core. He reached for his legal pad and began writing a letter to Dorothy Ames, the attorney Philip had identified. Her preliminary case review had already flagged critical irregularities in the evidence chain. Specifically, the metadata on Andrea's bruising photographs and discrepancies in the 911 call location data. Jerome had studied enough law in the prison library now to understand exactly how significant these irregularities were. His letter to Dorothy was precise and factual. He detailed the financial timeline, the business takeover mechanics, the systematic way Grant had absorbed Carter Construction's infrastructure. He included specific names, dates, and document references that Dorothy's team could verify independently. This wasn't an emotional appeal. It was a blueprint for dismantling what Andrea and Grant had built on his name. While Dorothy began the post-conviction review process, Jerome immersed himself in studying real estate law, contract formation, and business entity structure. He wasn't just preparing for freedom, he was architecting what came after. Every legal text, every procedure manual, every business formation guideline became another tool in his inventory. Through Philip, Jerome began quietly reaching out to his former clients, not to the companies, but to the specific project managers and developers he had built relationships with over 9 years. These weren't desperate appeals. They were careful seeds being planted for what would become Carter Built LLC, already registered in Philip's name, waiting for Jerome's exoneration to transfer cleanly. The cell lights dimmed for evening count. Jerome turned on his small desk lamp and opened his legal pad to a fresh page. His handwriting was steady as he wrote, "I don't need what they took back. I'm building something they never got close to." He underlined it once, the pencil making a precise line beneath the words. Then he turned to a new page and began detailing his next research request for Philip. Specific questions about digital forensics and cell tower data that Dorothy's team would need for the evidence review. The night settled around him, but Jerome kept writing. Each word was another board cut square, another nail driven true. He was building something new, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in the same methodical way he had always built everything that lasted. The Saturday morning sun cast long shadows across Delia Cross's front porch as Philip Carter stood at her door. Not a phone call this time, not a note left in her mailbox, a direct, unavoidable presence requiring her to finally face what she had been carrying for nearly 2 years. When Delia opened the door, her face held the weary recognition of someone who had been rehearsing this moment in her mind. She didn't seem surprised to see Philip there. If anything, she looked relieved, like someone finally confronting a weight they had grown tired of bearing alone. "I was wondering when someone would come," she said quietly, stepping back to let him in. Inside, her kitchen was bright and neat, everything in its place. She moved through it with the automatic familiarity of someone who had lived there a long time, pulling down coffee mugs, measuring grounds, filling the pot with water. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked. "I should have said something sooner," she said, her back still turned to Philip. "I've been thinking about it every day since the trial." Philip sat at her kitchen table, taking out a small recorder. "Would you mind if I record our conversation, Ms. Cross? Everything you say will be treated as part of a formal legal review." Delia nodded, bringing the coffee to the table. She stared into her mug for a long moment before speaking. 2 weeks before the trial, a woman came to my door. Well-dressed, very professional. She had this way about her. Confident, like she knew exactly what she was doing. She said she was a community liaison working with the district attorney's office. Delia's hands tightened around her coffee mug. She told me Jerome Carter had a documented history of domestic violence, said there were other women who had come forward, but they were afraid to testify. She made it sound like my testimony was crucial, like I would be protecting not just Andrea, but other women too. She got up suddenly, went to a drawer by the sink, and came back with a business card. The edges were worn, like she had handled it many times, thinking about making this call, but never quite finding the courage. She left this. I kept it, though I'm not sure why. Maybe part of me knew something wasn't right. Philip took the card carefully. Paula Weston, the name read, with a phone number but no office address. She shaped how I understood what I was supposed to say. Delia continued. She never told me to lie. She just helped me see the story the way she wanted me to see it. The shouting I heard, the crash, she helped me frame it as something more sinister than it was. Delia's voice caught. But that's not even the worst part. There's something else, something I saw that morning, the morning before Jerome was arrested. She stood up and walked to her kitchen window, looking out at the street as if watching the memory replay itself. It was early, maybe 6:15, still dark out. I was up making coffee, and I saw a car pull up across the street. A man got out. I recognized him later from a construction sign on Maple Avenue. Grant Tobias. Her voice grew quieter. He was standing in Jerome's driveway with Andrea. He had some kind of bag with him. The way they were together, it wasn't like strangers. It wasn't like business associates. They knew each other. Really knew each other, if you understand what I mean. She turned back to Philip. They talked for maybe 5 minutes. Easy, comfortable, like they'd done this before. I knew what I was seeing. I told myself it wasn't my business. But then, Jerome was arrested that night, and I still said nothing. Philip made sure the recorder was still running. Would you be willing to provide a formal statement to Jerome's attorney? Everything you've just told me? Yes, Delia said without hesitation. I should have done it a long time ago. That woman, Paula Weston, she made me feel like I was doing the right thing. But I've known since the verdict came down that I wasn't. I've been carrying that knowledge every day since. Back at the prison, Jerome sat in the visiting room reviewing the transcript of Delia's conversation. His face remained impassive as he read, but his pencil moved steadily across his legal pad, adding Paula Weston's name to the list. He paused, studying the transcript again. The photographs, he said quietly to Philip. They were too professional, too well lit. Someone with real equipment took those pictures. He left a space below Paula Weston's name on the pad. Tell Dorothy to trace the metadata on the photographs. Whoever's device they were taken on, that person is connected to this. The pictures didn't stage themselves. Jerome stood at the metal visitation table, his hands pressed flat against its surface, as he read Dorothy's forensic summary. Philip sat quietly, watching his cousin's face remain perfectly still, while his eyes moved methodically through each page. The report was thorough, clinical in its precision. The photographs that helped convict Jerome had been taken on a device registered to Brett Calloway, a marketing contractor who did regular work for Tobias and Associates. The metadata showed manual alterations to the timestamps, amateur work that any skilled forensic analyst could detect. The bruising patterns themselves when examined by medical experts, displayed none of the subsurface characteristics of actual trauma. The coloring was too uniform, the edges too defined. It was makeup, professionally applied. The makeup artist has been identified, Philip said quietly. Brett gave up her name as soon as Dorothy's team confronted him with the device registration and timeline. She's already provided a statement confirming Grant hired her directly. Jerome nodded once, still reading. His fingers traced a line in the report about the cell tower data. Andrea's phone had pinged off a tower 3 blocks from their house at the exact moment she claimed to be calling 911 from their kitchen. The tower location placed her precisely where Delia had seen Grant's car parked that morning. Dorothy's audio analyst had isolated background sounds from the 911 recording, the subtle acoustics of a vehicle interior, the faint hum of an engine at idle. Andrea hadn't been standing in their kitchen terrified. She had been sitting in Grant's car, performing terror with the same precision she had practiced everything else. The lead investigator from Jerome's case started cooperating last week, Philip continued. He told Dorothy off the record that the photographs were what pushed the prosecutor to move forward, but he'd had doubts about the metadata from the beginning. His department didn't have the forensic resources to pursue it at the time. Jerome set the report down and picked up Dorothy's motion filing. She had constructed it beautifully, each piece of evidence building on the last, creating an unbreakable chain of documented conspiracy. The state had already opened a formal review. Brett Calloway's statement was particularly damaging. He had provided exact details about Grant's instructions for the staging session, including the specific lighting setup Grant had requested to ensure the bruising photographs would be convincing enough for court. Brett rolled quickly, Philip noted. Dorothy said he tried the "I didn't know what the photos were for" defense for about 10 minutes, before his attorney advised him to cooperate fully. He gave them everything: the makeup artist's contact, the staging location, Grant's specific instructions. He kept good records. Jerome's expression didn't change, but his shoulders settled slightly. The subtle shift of a man seeing pieces fall exactly where he had calculated they would land. Dorothy says 60 days, Philip said. Maybe less? The state's review is moving fast now that the lead investigator is cooperating. She says to be ready. Jerome picked up his legal pad. He always had one with him now, after nearly 2 years of using them to build this case, piece by piece. He turned to a fresh page and began writing in his precise architectural hand. Not questions, not possibilities. A sequence of specific actions, each one built on the foundation of what Dorothy's evidence had just confirmed. First, contact every major client relationship he had built over 10 years, not through the company, through the people. The project managers and developers who had trusted Jerome Carter's name specifically. Second, register Carter Built LLC through Philip's property management company. Have the paperwork ready for transfer once exoneration cleared. Third, reach out to Curtis and Michael, the 2 crew leaders who had declined Grant's offers. Begin rebuilding the core team. Fourth, document every financial transaction Andrea had executed using his power of attorney. Create a complete record of the conspiracy's money trail. He wrote each step with the same careful attention he had once used to draw up project timelines. This was just another build. The materials were different, but the principles were the same. Start with the foundation. Check every connection. Make sure each piece could bear the weight of what came next. Philip watched him write, understanding that his cousin wasn't hoping anymore. He was building. Everything that happened from this point forward would happen because Jerome had prepared for it, measured it, and calculated its exact execution. You ready? Philip asked quietly. Jerome looked up from the legal pad. I've been ready since the first night I was in here. Now I have what I need to start. The morning air hit Jerome's face like a forgotten memory. He stood just beyond the prison gate, letting his lungs fill with something that felt bigger than air. Not better exactly, just larger, uncontained by concrete and steel. The sun was barely breaking over the Georgia pines, painting everything in soft gold that made the world look newer than it was. Philip waited by his car, hands in his pockets, watching his cousin breathe. They embraced without words, a quick, firm grip that said everything necessary about family and time and patience. Neither of them lingered in the moment. They were men who built things, not men who performed feelings about them. The car interior smelled like coffee and fresh upholstery. Jerome settled into the passenger seat, his few possessions in a small bag between his feet. He noticed the fresh detail job, the careful maintenance. Philip had prepared for this morning the way he prepared for everything, with quiet attention to detail. Without a word, Philip reached behind the seat and handed Jerome a thick manila folder. The weight of it felt significant. Jerome opened it carefully, the way he used to open blueprints at job sites, with focus, with purpose, with the understanding that what he was about to review mattered. The contents were organized chronologically. Every fraudulent transaction Andrea had executed using his power of attorney. Every LLC filing Grant had submitted to absorb Carter Construction's infrastructure. Every contract Grant had acquired through whispered implications about Jerome's stability. Bank statements showing the monthly payments to Andrea's shell company, labeled as consulting retainer, in Grant's business records, beginning 8 months before Jerome's arrest. Then the photographs. Someone, probably Brett Calloway, given his marketing role, had documented Grant's gradual occupation of Jerome's life with professional precision. Grant at industry events, introducing himself as Carter Construction's new managing partner. Grant meeting with Jerome's former clients, shaking hands in conference rooms Jerome had sat in less than 3 years ago. Grant and Andrea together at neighborhood gatherings, playing the role of the happy couple who had weathered difficulty and emerged stronger. The last photograph stopped Jerome's breath for a moment. It was from a neighborhood social media post. A summer cookout in what used to be his backyard. Grant stood at Jerome's Weber kettle grill, spatula in hand like he owned it. Andrea laughed beside him, wine glass raised, completely at ease in a space that still had Jerome's handprints on every surface. Jerome stared at the grill, not at Andrea's face, not at Grant's confident stance, but at the grill itself. He had bought it with cash 3 years ago, assembled it alone in the driveway on a Saturday afternoon. He remembered checking each connection, making sure the legs were perfectly level, taking satisfaction in the precision of simple things done right. He closed the folder deliberately, set it on his lap, looked out at the highway unwinding ahead of them. How long before they know I'm out? His voice was steady, measured. Philip merged onto the interstate before answering. Grant's had someone watching the facility since Dorothy filed the motion. He knew before you cleared the gate. Jerome nodded once. Good. I want him watching. Let him think knowing where I am means he still has control of this. They drove in comfortable silence for several miles. Then Jerome opened the folder again, this time focusing on the legal documents in the front. Dorothy's fraud lawsuit against Grant's LLC was beautifully constructed. Every fraudulent transfer documented, every misused power of attorney filing highlighted, every shell company connection traced to its source. 4 client letters of intent already signed with Carter Built, Philip reported, reading Jerome's focus. 3 more meetings scheduled next week. Curtis called yesterday. He and Michael are ready to start as soon as you give the word. They've kept in touch with 2 other guys from the original crew. You'll have a solid foundation team on day 1. Jerome absorbed this information with the same quiet focus he had applied to everything for the past 2 years and 9 months. Each piece was a building material, each connection a load-bearing joint. He had been assembling this structure since the first night inside, and now it was ready to stand. He took out his phone, a new one Philip had waiting, his old number restored. He scrolled to Andrea's contact. She had kept the same number, probably believing he would never be in a position to use it against her. The kind of confidence that comes from thinking you've won completely. He pressed dial. The phone rang 3 times. He could hear the exact moment she recognized his number, the slight catch in her breath before she answered. "Andrea." His voice was perfectly level. "I'd like to meet at the house. There are some property matters we need to discuss in person." He paused for exactly 2 seconds. "Bring Grant." Jerome stood in his former kitchen for a moment, letting the familiar scent of coffee and pine cleaner wash over him. Nothing had changed. The same granite counters he'd installed himself. The same light fixture he'd rewired one Sunday afternoon. The same wooden table where he'd spent countless nights reviewing contracts and building estimates. He pulled out the chair he'd always used, the one with the slight wobble he'd never quite fixed, and sat down. Dorothy Ames settled into the chair to his left, her briefcase resting against the table leg. Philip took his position near the back door, shoulders squared, presence solid and grounding. Jerome placed a single manila folder on the table's worn surface. Inside was everything: 3 years of evidence, documentation, and carefully gathered testimony. He folded his hands on top of it and waited, his breathing steady and controlled. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the morning quiet. Footsteps on the front walk. Keys in the lock. Jerome kept his eyes fixed on the folder, his expression perfectly neutral. Grant entered first, his confidence filling the doorway like expensive cologne. He wore a tailored suit that probably cost more than Jerome used to make in 2 weeks. His smile was practiced, professional. The smile of a man who believed he still held all the cards. "Jerome." Grant's voice carried that particular tone of false warmth as he extended his hand. "Welcome home." Jerome looked at the offered hand without expression, without movement. After a moment that stretched just long enough to be uncomfortable, Grant withdrew it, his smile flickering only slightly as he took the seat across the table. Andrea followed, her composure perfect as always. She'd changed her hair, shortened it to shoulder length. She sat beside Grant, her hands folded in her lap, her face a masterpiece of controlled neutrality. 3 years of practice had made her very good at appearing unaffected. Jerome studied them both for a long moment. Then, with deliberate slowness, he opened the folder and began laying documents on the table one at a time. The photograph metadata report came first. Detailed analysis showing the images were captured on Brett Calloway's device and altered afterward. He placed it precisely in the center of the table. Next, the cell tower data proving Andrea's phone was in Grant's car during the 911 call, not in their kitchen as she'd testified. He set it beside the first document. The forensic analysis of the bruising photographs followed. Expert testimony confirming the marks were consistent with professional makeup application, not physical trauma. Each page made a soft sound as it met the wooden surface. The makeup artist's sworn statement came next, followed by Brett Calloway's full confession detailing Grant's instructions and the staging location. Jerome placed them side by side, the papers perfectly aligned. Paula Weston's cooperation agreement landed next, her complete account of Grant's directions, the script she used on Delia, the cash payments she'd documented. The pages seemed to carry physical weight as they settled. Delia's formal testimony followed, her detailed account of what she saw that morning and what Paula had instructed her to say. Jerome placed it with the same precision he'd used to lay foundation lines at job sites. Finally, he set down the financial records, the LLC filings, the shell company documentation, and at the very top, the monthly consulting retainer payments to Andrea's maiden name entity, beginning 8 months before Jerome's arrest, continuing through the trial, documented in Grant's own business records. The kitchen was absolutely silent. Jerome looked directly at Andrea, his voice quiet, but carrying perfect clarity. "You were being paid. Before the arrest, before the trial, before any of it. You negotiated your compensation first. He let the words settle between them. "I want you to understand that I know that. Not as a suspicion. As a documented fact." Andrea's composure held, but something shifted behind her eyes. The particular shift of someone realizing the story they'd prepared had become completely irrelevant. Grant started to speak. Jerome turned to look at him with an expression so devoid of emotion that Grant's words died in his throat. "I'm not speaking to you," Jerome said quietly. "I'll be speaking to you through Dorothy, from this point forward." He turned back to Andrea, his voice steady and final. "I built everything in this house. I built the business that paid for it. I built the life you used as cover while you were planning to have me removed from it." He paused. "And I want you to hear me say that clearly, in this house, at this table, before everything that is coming for you actually comes." The Tuesday morning sun had barely cleared the Atlanta skyline when two police cruisers pulled up to the Tobias and Associates office building. Grant was in the middle of what he thought was a routine project meeting with two major developers, men who had worked with Jerome for years before shifting their contracts to Grant's firm during Jerome's incarceration. What Grant didn't know was that Jerome had arranged their presence specifically for this moment. The officers entered without ceremony, badges visible, warrant in hand. Grant stood from behind his desk, his confidence faltering for the first time as understanding dawned in his eyes. The developers, Mike Harrison and James Chen, watched silently as the officers read Grant his rights: evidence tampering, conspiracy to commit fraud, wire fraud, perjury by procurement, obstruction of justice. Grant's staff gathered in the doorway, watching their boss being led out in handcuffs. By noon, the story had spread through Atlanta's contracting community like wildfire. Within 24 hours, two more development firms that had been working with Tobias and Associates reached out to Philip about availability. 7 years. The sentence came down like a hammer, along with the court-ordered dissolution of Tobias and Associates pending litigation. The fraudulent business transfer Jerome had documented was reversed completely. 3 days after Grant's arrest, Andrea was taken into custody at the house, Jerome's former home. Her private attorney, reviewing the mountain of evidence Dorothy's team had assembled, advised her in clear terms that fighting the charges would only make things worse. She entered a guilty plea and received 4 years, mandatory minimum, no possibility of probation. The judge specifically noted in sentencing that her participation had been premeditated and financially compensated from the beginning. Paula Weston's cooperation with prosecutors wasn't enough to keep her out of prison. The judge denied probation, citing the severity of the original crime her actions had facilitated. 18 months in minimum security, and her paralegal certification was permanently revoked. Brett Calloway received 12 months. His "I didn't know what the photos were for" defense crumbling under the weight of the evidence showing his direct participation in the staging. Jerome's contractor's license was reinstated with full backstanding and clean history. The title irregularity Dorothy had identified in the property transfer forced a complete review. The house had to be sold to satisfy the judgment. Andrea and Grant vacated before the order was even final. 18 months passed like water under a bridge. Carter-Built LLC grew steadily, accumulating 12 active contracts across Atlanta, 3 commercial projects, and 9 residential, including 2 for development firms that had specifically sought Jerome out because of who he was rather than what company name appeared on the paperwork. Philip stepped into the role of operations manager as naturally as breathing. Curtis, back from the beginning, ran the largest crew with the same quiet competence he'd always shown. Jerome hired 4 new workers, including 2 young men from his old neighborhood who reminded him of himself at 22. He took extra time with them, showing them the specific techniques that had taken him years to master, the way someone had done for him once. When Terrell came to the office that afternoon, Jerome listened to him without interruption. Terrell didn't make excuses about accepting Grant's offer. He simply explained the pressure he'd been under and acknowledged his shame directly. Jerome offered him a probationary position, making it clear that trust would need to be rebuilt. Terrell accepted immediately, understanding the opportunity for what it was. Dorothy's handwritten note arrived the week Andrea's sentencing was finalized. Jerome read it twice before framing it. 4 years, mandatory minimum. No alternatives offered. The record reflects the full truth. You did this. Every line of the investigation started with your list. This outcome was yours. He hung it beside his contractor's license, a reminder of what precision and patience could accomplish. One evening over takeout in the office, Philip carefully asked if Jerome ever thought about Andrea. Jerome considered the question with his usual thoroughness. "I think about the man I was when I trusted her," he said finally. "How complete that trust was. How I gave it without keeping any back." He paused, choosing his words precisely. "I don't want to be that naive again. But I also don't want to become someone who can't trust anyone. That would mean she changed me permanently. I'm not giving her that." "What do you want?" Philip asked. "I want to trust people who have actually earned it. I want to give what I give to people who are worth what I'm worth." Jerome met Philip's eyes steadily. "I know what I'm worth now. That's the only thing I'm keeping." The job site at dawn held that particular energy of things beginning. Jerome stood with blueprints in his hands, watching his crew arrive one by one, their breath visible in the early morning air. The sound of work starting rose around him, the grounded, solid sound of people building something that would stand long after this moment was a memory. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.